Bring the coffee, intern, Clay snapped. I placed the cup down with quiet precision. Now sit in the back, he waved. I walked to the podium instead. Sit down, he yelled. I tapped the mic. I would like to call this shareholder meeting to order. Item 1. Removing the board member who thinks the majority shareholder is an intern. The room froze into a block of jagged silence. Clay looked at me with a wild, twitching eye. The steam from his coffee rose like a ghost between us. My father built this empire with grace and caluses. He always told me that real power stays silent until it is ready to strike. For 6 months, I acted as a shadow. I fetched files and absorbed their casual insults. I watched Clay treat the company bank account like a personal trophy. He thought I was just the daughter who lacked a head for business. He was wrong. I was simply the predator in a polyester suit. I could smell the expensive gin on his breath. Clay tried to stand, but his legs seemed made of wet paper. This is a joke, he stammered. I slid a notarized stack of papers across the mahogany surface. That document represents 51% of the voting shares held by Red Clay Holdings. That name was not a tribute to you, Clay. It referred to the Georgia soil where my father was born. I am the sole signatory. The board members looked away. They were vultures who had suddenly realized the carcass was actually a lion. I turned to the actuary. Greg, tell the room about the Aspen retreat. Greg swallowed hard and looked at the floor. He whispered a number that made the room turn cold. $145,000. It was all company money. Clay had spent it on lift tickets and fine wine, while our drivers used duct tape on their rigs. I watched the light reflect off Clay's expensive watch. It was a ticking clock on a life he could no longer afford. His tan turned a sickly gray. The liquidation plan sat on the table. It was a glossy lie designed to gut our history. You wanted to sell the fleet for scrap value, I said. You wanted to fire 400 men who sent my father Christmas cards. My voice did not shake. It was the sound of a closing coffin lid. I looked at Arthur. He sat on the left side of the table as I instructed. He raised his hand first. One by one, the other board members followed him like trained seals. Clay finally collapsed into his leather chair. It was the same chair my father died in. Security is waiting in the hall, I told him. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. No files and no electronics. I turned back to the mic. The music has stopped, gentlemen. Now we find out who is actually sitting at the table. I picked up the heavy red folder and sat at the head. I felt the leather against my back. The company was finally breathing again. The heavy oak doors clicked shut as security led Clay away. I scanned the remaining faces around the long mahogany table. They sat rigid, like stone statues carved from fear and guilt. My objective was simple. I had to secure the server room before Clay's remote wipe command could execute. My fingers traced the cold surface of an encrypted drive in my pocket. If I failed, 6 months of digital evidence would vanish into thin air. Time was a hungry predator. A red light began pulsing on the wall panel. The system was already resetting. Greg, get the IT override codes now, I commanded. He fumbled with his tablet, sweat slicking his pale forehead. The actuary looked like he might vanish under the table. He locked the admin portal. Greg whispered. I felt the pressure mounting in my chest. Clay was a snake, but he was a prepared one. He had planted a digital bomb in the company's heart. I sprinted toward the service elevator. The hallway felt miles long. Every fluorescent light overhead flickered with mechanical malice. I reached the server room and shoved my key into the slot. The air inside was freezing and filled with hum of cooling fans. Blue LEDs blinked rapidly, signaling a data purge in progress. I saw a thick black cable disconnected on the floor. Someone had physically tampered with the backup rack. The room felt like a cold tomb. Kevin, talk to me, I shouted into my phone. My heart hammered against my ribs. The wipe is at 40%. The IT kid replied. His voice sounded thin through the speaker. You have to bridge the connection manually. I looked at the severed wires. They were frayed and sharp. I grabbed the copper ends, ignoring the bite of the current. My vision blurred as the electricity surged through my skin. I held on because the drivers were counting on me. Suddenly, the screen on the main console flickered green. A new directory appeared. It was labeled Project Liquid Private. I gasped as a list of offshore accounts scrolled past. Clay wasn't just skimming from our profits. He was selling the company's physical land to a foreign entity. The power balance shifted instantly. This wasn't just embezzlement anymore. It was corporate treason. I pulled the data onto my drive. The purge stopped at 90%. I had the smoking gun. I walked back to the boardroom with steady steps. My hands were still shaking from the shock. I dropped the drive onto the table. He sold the Ohio warehouse land yesterday, I told the board. Arthur gasped, clutching his cane. The room exploded into frantic murmurs. These men finally realized they were victims too. Clay had planned to leave them with nothing but legal bills. The betrayal was absolute. I watched their greed turn into a weapon for my use. The victory felt heavy and bitter. Greg looked up from his screen with wide eyes. Rebecca, there is something else, he said. His voice was trembling. He turned the tablet toward me. A hidden clause in the land sale was now active. Because Clay was removed, the entire fleet was now collateral for a loan we could not pay. My victory had triggered a debt trap. We had the company back, but we were already broke. I looked at my father's portrait. The silence in the boardroom was thick enough to choke on. I stared at the tablet screen, as the numbers turned a violent shade of red. My objective had shifted from victory to raw survival. We held the throne, but the kingdom was mortgaged to the hilt. Clay had tied our trucks to a predatory high-interest loan. If we did not pay the first installment by midnight, the bank would seize every engine we owned. The walls felt narrow. How much is the immediate shortfall? I asked. My voice sounded like grinding gravel. Greg tapped his screen with trembling fingers. $6 million, he replied. Clay moved the operating cash into the offshore account before security grabbed him. I looked at Arthur, whose face had gone ghostly pale. We had control, yet we lacked the fuel to keep the engines turning. The board members began whispering like rats on a sinking ship. I needed a miracle, or a weapon. I remembered the small brass key hidden in my father's desk drawer. He always mentioned a rainy day fund that no accountant could find. I stood up and walked toward the heavy oak desk. The wood was cold under my fingertips. I found the lock tucked behind a false panel. It clicked open with a satisfying mechanical snap. Inside lay a single ledger bound in worn leather. It was not money. It was a list of names and private favors. I scanned the pages until I saw a familiar signature. It belonged to the CEO of the very bank holding our debt. My father had saved his daughter after a hit and run 20 years ago. The secret was buried here in ink. I felt a surge of cold clarity. This was the leverage I needed to stall the seizure. I pulled out my phone and dialed the private number listed. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. The man on the other end answered after one ring. I did not introduce myself. I simply read the date and the location of the accident from the ledger. There was a sharp intake of breath on the line. "What do you want?" he whispered. His voice was filled with ancient fear. "I want the loan restructured by morning," I said. "And I want the interest wiped." The power dynamic shifted. I held his entire life in my hand. He agreed within seconds. The digital clock on the wall stopped its frantic countdown. I hung up and looked at the board members. They were staring at me, as if I were a stranger. "The debt is handled," I announced. But I knew the bank's CEO wouldn't forget how I obtained his cooperation. Greg let out a long breath of relief. But then a notification chimed on the big screen. A new email from an unknown sender appeared. The subject line was simply "I knew." I clicked the message and my blood turned to ice. It contained a photo of me taken 10 minutes ago inside the server room. The angle was high and wide. It was from a camera I had not found during my sweep. Someone else was still inside the building watching us. They had seen the ledger, and they knew about the bank. My secret weapon was no longer secret. I looked at the ceiling and saw a tiny red eye blinking back. I stared at the tiny red lens embedded in the smoke detector. My objective was to find the observer before they leaked the ledger. Fear tasted like copper in my mouth. I grabbed a heavy chair and smashed the plastic casing. Shards of white casing rained onto the mahogany. I pulled a wireless transmitter from the wreckage. It was military-grade and far more advanced than anything Clay possessed. Someone else was playing a much deeper game. The room felt crowded. "Greg, lock down the building's external signals," I barked. He jumped, his fingers dancing over the tablet. "I can't stop a dedicated uplink," he said. The pressure in my chest tightened like a vice. If that photo reached the press, the bank deal would look like blackmail. My father's legacy would be stained forever. I looked at the board members. They were staring at the transmitter in my hand. One of them was likely the conduit for the spy. I walked the perimeter of the table, watching their eyes. Davies kept adjusting his tie with shaking hands. Miller wouldn't look at me at all. I noticed a faint blue glow from Miller's pocket. I reached out and snatched his phone. He tried to protest, but I shoved him back into his seat. The screen showed a live feed of the boardroom. The recipient was labeled the broker. I realized Miller was not just a vulture. He was a mole. "How long have you been selling us out?" I whispered. Miller's face went white under the fluorescent lights. He didn't answer, so I dropped the phone into his lukewarm coffee. The liquid hissed, and the screen went black. I turned to Arthur, seeking a moment of solidarity. He looked at the ruined phone with a strange, hollow expression. He wasn't surprised. He looked disappointed. The power shifted in a way I didn't expect. Arthur knew about the mole. He was protecting the assets. "Rebecca," Arthur rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves. "Your father knew we needed a fallback if you failed." I felt a new betrayal sting my eyes. Even my father hadn't fully trusted me to win. The ledger wasn't just a weapon. It was a test I was never supposed to take alone. I felt small in the massive chair. My objective was slipping away. I needed to know who the broker really was. I pulled the ledger close to my chest. "Who is he, Arthur?" I demanded. The senior board member looked at the portrait on the wall. "He is the man who truly owns the debt," Arthur replied. "The bank CEO is just a figurehead." I realized the loan restructure was a trap. I had revealed my hand to the very person I needed to hide from. The room seemed to tilt. I wasn't the predator anymore. I was the bait. A low chime echoed from the boardroom speakers. A distorted voice filled the space. "Thank you for the ledger, Rebecca," it said. "The secrets inside are worth more than the company." I looked at the table and realized my drive was gone. Greg stood by the door, tablet clutched tight. The nervous actuary was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. He had been the broker's insurance policy all along, and he just stole the keys to the kingdom. Greg backed toward the service elevator, the stolen drive clutched in his hand. My objective was to retrieve that data before he hit the street. The air in the boardroom felt heavy and stagnant. Arthur remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the portrait of my father. I lunged for the door. But Davies blocked my path with a heavy shoulder. The pressure was mounting as the elevator pinged. Greg slipped inside and the steel doors hissed shut. I was trapped. "Let me through, Davies," I hissed. My voice carried the weight of a death sentence. He didn't move, his face a mask of sweating indifference. "The broker pays better than a sinking ship, Rebecca," he replied. I realized the corruption ran deeper than Clay's clumsy greed. It was a calculated harvest of my family's work. I reached for the emergency alarm on the wall. The sound shattered the silence, a piercing scream that echoed through the vents. The game had changed. The building's power suddenly surged and died. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long, crimson shadows across the mahogany. I used the confusion to shove Davies aside. I ran for the stairs, my boots thundering against the concrete. My chest burned with every ragged breath. I reached the lobby just as the elevator doors groaned open. Greg was there, but he wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits stood waiting. They looked like professional cleaners. I stopped at the landing. The men didn't reach for weapons. Instead, one held up a tablet showing a live feed of our Ohio warehouse. A black van was idling near the main gate. "The drive for the safety of your drivers," the tall one said. His voice was flat and robotic. It was a hostage exchange for a digital ghost. I felt the leverage vanish. I was no longer fighting for a company. I was fighting for 400 lives. I stepped forward. "Give them the drive, Greg," I said. My voice was a hollow whisper. Greg looked at the men, then back at me. A flash of hesitation crossed his face. He realized he was just another loose end in their ledger. He tossed the drive toward me instead of the suits. It skittered across the polished marble floor. I dove for it, my fingers scraping the stone. The tall man stepped on my hand. The pain was sharp and cold. "That was a mistake," the man said. He picked up the drive and tucked it into his pocket. He looked at Greg with a chilling lack of emotion. The van on the tablet screen began to move. I heard a distant roar of an engine. But it wasn't the van. It was the sound of 100 semi-trucks. My drivers were not waiting for a savior. They were coming to take their home back. The lobby glass began to vibrate. The front doors swung open, and a sea of high, visibility vests poured inside. They didn't look for me or the drive. They went straight for the elevators. Leading them was Mrs. Higgins, holding a heavy wrench like a scepter. "We heard the alarm, honey," she shouted over the din. The suits retreated toward the back exit, realizing they were outnumbered. But as the crowd surged, Arthur stepped close, and I felt a sharp prick in my neck. Everything began to fade into a blur. The cold marble floor rushed up to meet my face. Darkness clawed at the edges of my vision as the sedative surged. My objective was to stay conscious and identify my attacker. The roar of the truck engines outside sounded like a distant thunderstorm. Through the blurred chaos of high, visibility vests, I saw a pair of polished Oxfords. They did not belong to the drivers or the cleaners. I felt a hand reach into my pocket. The ledger was gone. My strength failed completely. I woke up strapped to a metal chair in the maintenance basement. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and ozone. My neck throbbed where the needle had pierced the skin. A single bare bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows. Greg sat across from me, looking battered and terrified. His glasses were cracked across the left lens. He was not the mastermind I had feared earlier. He was just another victim of the game. We were both bait now. The heavy steel door creaked open, revealing Arthur. He leaned heavily on his silver-topped cane, his expression unreadable. He did not look like the frail mentor I had once loved. He looked like a man who had outlived his conscience. The silver top of the cane was actually a disguised transmitter. He placed my father's ledger on a workbench. I realized then that Arthur was the broker. He had played the long game since the day my father died. He wanted it all. "You were never supposed to find the ledger, Rebecca?" Arthur rasped. His voice was cold and lacked any trace of fatherly warmth. He opened the book to the final, hidden page. There was a signature I had missed in my earlier haste. It was my own name, dated 5 years ago. My father had signed my life away to secure the company's first major loan. I was the collateral for the entire empire. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was property. I looked at the signature through tear-filled eyes. The ink was faded, but the legal weight was crushing. Arthur smiled, a thin line of satisfaction on his withered face. "This makes me your legal guardian in the eyes of the bank," he explained. He held a pen toward my bound hands. He needed me to sign the final transfer of the land assets. If I signed, the drivers would lose everything. If I refused, Greg would not leave this basement alive. The pressure was absolute. I took the pen with shaking fingers, feeling the cold metal. Greg shook his head, his eyes pleading behind the shattered glass. I looked at the ledger one last time. I noticed a small, oily thumbprint near my name. It was fresh and smelled of diesel fuel. My father had not signed this document 5 years ago. Arthur had forged it today using the ink from the maintenance shop. The power balance shifted in a heartbeat. I was not property. I was being played. "You missed a detail, Arthur," I whispered. I lunged forward, slamming the pen into his thigh. He shrieked, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. I used the moment to kick the workbench, toppling the heavy ledger. Greg used his feet to trip Arthur as he stumbled back. We were fighting for our lives in the dark. I felt the zip ties on my wrists snap under the strain. I was free, but Arthur was reaching for a heavy pipe. He was desperate. The basement door burst open before he could strike. Mrs. Higgins stood there, backed by 3 massive warehouse loaders. They carried heavy wrenches and looked ready for a war. Arthur dropped the pipe, his face a mask of sudden, pathetic defeat. The drivers found the secret feed. "Honey," she said. They had watched every second of the betrayal from the lobby screens. The truth was out. There was no hiding now. Arthur slumped against the cold stone wall, a broken man. We marched Arthur up to the lobby in silence. The crowd of drivers parted like the Red Sea. They did not shout or jeer. The silence was far more terrifying than any noise. I held the forged ledger high for everyone to see. "The debt is a lie," I announced to the room. The men in suits were gone, vanished into the night. We had the building, the fleet, and the truth. But as I turned, I saw a police line forming. Someone called them. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand on his holster. He looked at the chaos, and then at the ledger in my hand. "We received a report of a violent takeover," he said. His eyes moved to Arthur's bleeding leg. The situation looked incriminating and messy. I realized Arthur had called them before we reached the lobby. He was going to use the law to finish what his lies started. A new complication had arrived. I was still holding the smoking gun. The lead officer moved closer, his boots clicking on the marble. I had one goal. Prove Arthur was the aggressor before they cuffed us all. The air in the lobby was thick with the scent of diesel and rain. I held the ledger tight against my chest. "He forged this today," I said, pointing to the fresh oily thumbprint. The officer squinted at the mark but kept his hand on his belt. The pressure rose as sirens wailed outside. Arthur smiled through his pain. Arthur leaned against the wall, his face a mask of false agony. "She attacked me in the basement." He groaned to the police. He pointed at the red stain on his thigh where I had struck him. The officers shifted their weight, eyeing the angry crowd of drivers. They saw a mob of laborers led by a woman with wild eyes. The optics were terrible for us. I felt the leverage slipping away, as zip ties were pulled from leather pouches. We were losing. "Check the security feed from the maintenance hall," Greg shouted. His voice cracked with desperation as he stepped forward. The lead officer nodded to his partner, who headed toward the back. Arthur's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I realized the camera I had missed earlier was still recording everything. It wasn't just Miller's mole feed. There was a hardwired backup system that Arthur forgot to scrub. The power balance shifted as the partner radioed back a confirmation. The partner returned, holding a small digital tablet. He showed the lead officer the footage of Arthur forging my name. The video was grainy, but the betrayal was unmistakable. We watched Arthur press his thumb into the wet ink of the shop. The officer turned his attention away from me and toward the senior board member. "Mr. Arthur, you have some explaining to do," the officer said. The room seemed to exhale. The truth was finally written in light and pixels. Arthur tried to stand, but the loaders blocked his path. "That footage is manipulated," he barked, his voice losing its refined edge. He looked at the drivers, seeking a single face of pity. He found none. The men and women my father hired stood like a wall of iron. They knew their value now. I stepped forward and handed the ledger to the officer. "There is more evidence of embezzlement in his private safe," I added. The trap was finally closing tight. The officers helped Arthur to his feet and clicked steel cuffs onto his wrists. The silver-topped cane was seized as evidence of the hidden transmitter. As they led him toward the cruisers, the drivers let out a low cheer. It wasn't a roar of victory, but a sound of deep relief. The company was finally ours, but the cost was etched on every face. I looked at the glass doors and saw the sun beginning to rise. The night was over. Greg walked over to me, wiping his cracked glasses on his shirt. "We still have to deal with the loan," he reminded me. The bank CEO was still expecting his pound of flesh by noon. Even with Arthur gone, the debt remained a massive, looming shadow. I looked at the ledger one more time. I noticed a small serial number etched into the spine. It wasn't just a book. It was a key to something much bigger. My heart began to race. I followed the serial number to the company's oldest safe in the maintenance basement. I used the code my father once whispered on his deathbed. The heavy iron door groaned open to reveal a stack of gold certificates. They were dated 1978. The year the company was born. This was the real rainy day fund my father had hidden. It was enough to clear the debt and modernize the entire fleet. The miracle had finally arrived in the dark. How did he hide this for so long? Greg whispered, staring at the wealth. My father never trusted banks, I realized. He trusted physical assets and the people who moved them. I felt a surge of pride that nearly brought me to tears. We could save the Ohio warehouse and give the drivers their raises. The future was bright and paved with gold. But as I reached for the stack, I felt a cold breeze. A side door was open. A shadow moved in the corner of the vault. I turned to find Clay standing there, holding a small silenced pistol. He had exploited the massive surge of drivers in the lobby to escape his police escort and waited for us to find the prize. "I told you I wouldn't go down alone," he hissed. He didn't want the money, he wanted the certificates burned. If the debt wasn't paid, the company would still die. He pulled the trigger. The sound was a soft puff. The world went silent again. The bullet grazed my shoulder, tearing through my blouse and skin. I dove behind the iron vault door, as the certificates scattered like golden leaves. My objective was simple. Even with my blood soaking the floor, I had to disarm Clay before he ruined our only chance at survival. The pain was a hot iron pressed against my bone. Greg scrambled for cover, his face white with terror. Clay stepped into the light, his eyes hollow and desperate. He leveled the pistol again. He was a man with nothing left to lose. "You took my life, Rebecca," Clay hissed. His hand trembled, but the barrel remained fixed on my head. I looked at the gold certificates near his feet. They were the lifeblood of 400 families. I realized Clay didn't want the money anymore. He wanted the void. He wanted to watch me fail just as he had. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. There was no more time for talk. I reached for a heavy brass ledger on the floor. I hurled the book with everything I had left. It struck Clay's wrist, and the gun discharged into the concrete ceiling. Dust and chips of stone rained down upon us. I lunged forward, tackling him into the wall. We hit the floor in a tangle of limbs and fury. I felt his fingers clawing at my throat. He was stronger than he looked. I grabbed a heavy stack of papers and shoved them against his face. He gagged, his grip loosening for a second. I rolled away and grabbed the discarded pistol. I held it steady with both hands, the weight cold and familiar. "It is over, Clay," I said. My voice was a flat line of ice. He slumped against the safe, coughing up the crumpled paper. He looked small and pathetic in the dim light. I realized then that my father had never feared this man. He had only pitied him. The power had never truly been in Clay's hands. It was always in the work. Greg emerged from the shadows and began collecting the scattered certificates. "The police are coming back down," he whispered. I didn't lower the weapon until I heard the heavy thud of boots. Greg had used the vault's intercom to alert the officers upstairs, and now security swarmed the vault, pinning Clay to the floor. I watched them haul him away for the final time. My shoulder throbbed, but the bleeding had slowed. We had the money. We had the company. I looked at the ledger. The names of the drivers remained safe and clean. I walked out of the basement and into the morning sun. The air was crisp and smelled of rain. 400 trucks were idling in the lot, their chrome shining like armor. Mrs. Higgins was waiting with a thermos of hot coffee. She didn't say a word. She just handed me the cup. I took a sip and felt the warmth spread through my chest. I looked at my reflection in the lobby glass. I was no longer the intern. I was finally home.